welcome to Fontribute, where we talk about fonts and their attributes. Fontribute. So hi everyone, hope you're all having a great week. This is Thomas Jockin of TypeThursday. I hope you're all having a great time. It was my birthday last week, by the way. Random side note, I wanted just to share. I had a great birthday, had a big old party, it was super fun, and yeah, really love talking with you guys and talking about font with you this week. So let's get started. So this week, we're going to talk about the genre called Humanist sans serifs. We talked last week about, more of a grotesque sans serif, but now we're going to talk more about a Humanist sans serif. And there was a typeface just came out this week that caught my attention, and I figured this would be a good opportunity to talk about that project and relate to a more common Humanist sans serif you may have known from your Type 1 class. So here I have two examples. One is Diurnal and Gill Sans. Gill Sans is what you would expect. It's what we talk about in Type 1. It's kind of this archetype of, when we talk about Humanist sans serifs, Gill Sans is normally the one we're going to talk about. Diurnal is this recent typeface release just came out from Typotheque, for my misremembering where it came from. So on the surface, things are similar, but there are also some differences I want to share with you guys, and I think are worth discussion. So let's get started. So what immediately drew to me to Diurnal was its lowercase a. And one of the also things from Gill Sans that's really distinct about that is its lowercase a. So let's get started with that. The first thing we can see is, for me, that drew attention, especially with Gill Sans. We look at how the bowl is, how is weight distributed in this typeface. Where is the heavier parts of the stroke and where are the lighter parts of the stroke? So we start demoing on this. So do we see in Gill Sans, we notice that, so you notice this thickest part's right here, on this part of the terminal, top part of the A. And then the next thick part is here and here. And then we see a dramatic dropping in weight over here, and at the end of the terminal. Basically, Gill Sans makes priority certain aspects of the strokes, and other ones are let to kind of drop out in different proportions. It's not all the same weight all across the board. I think what's interesting is to see that in contrast to Diurnal. Well, here's the thing. So we've got a reasonable equal amount of weight, both at this top of the terminal and the end of the terminal. And what we see is not as dramatic of a dropping in the weight here and here. And you compare that to Gill Sans next to it. So it's looking like it's lower contrast overall. There are some other the strategies in response to that. So one is, if you're looking at the counter, you see this counter in here, basically notice how it's kind of arching down. There's like this, it's kind of shaped like that. One thing I could already tell is that this is a wider shape. Diurnal basically chooses to kind of breathe more space around it by the size of that counter. So I can infer that from comparing the two. Also worth noticing is how, I always find this in A's. I always find A is very challenging. This bottom segment over here. Compare it between the two. Where the bowl connects back up to the stem, and then there's like this tail terminal in the A. How does it get rendered, and what takes priority, and how the stroke's going to be managed? Gill Sans basically makes a decision that the main stem stroke is more priority, and the bowl joint needs to really taper down really thin to compensate for that. And kind of hits relatively low. Like, what I mean by that is, see how much it cuts in down here to kind of joint up before the arching of the tail starts. It's relatively short. It's kind of low in the stroke. Diurnal does it much higher. It's much higher up in the stem where it connects. So this allows for a much deeper V cut right here. Kind of a V tapering right there. And in response to that, if you notice, the stress of the angle is maintained up here. So this bottom, and actually it seems like this bottom area over here is actually heavier than this top area over here. While as in Gill Sans, these two seem to match closer in weight. While in Diurnal, there is a variance. Basically, it's a priority. Basically, like we'll say this is like the primary stroke. This is like the secondary area. This is third. We could say this is, basically tied with third, and this is fourth over here. So the order of the stroke priority. What's the thickest part? What's the thinnest part? It's a different recipe in Diurna than Gill Sans in this case. This ends up giving Diurna more of a basically if you drew a calligraphic pen, you would expect the thinnest part's up here and like a thicker part down here coming in, right? And then the stem connects. So this part over here is really thin, this is relatively thicker. So it's following that model in Diurna. Also, a thing I noticed, I think this tends to because of the spacing decisions of Diurna. A decision was made in this terminal. You see how first was that angle, right, versus the vertical straightness of Gill Sans going on. So there's the obviously angle versus straight, but also notice the negative side bearing. See how this comes outside the font box, basically the side bearing on the right side. I think a lot of that might be this design can get away with it because notice it on the right side there's this extra, basically all this extra space. Well, that's because it has to compensate for this longer terminal over here. Gill Sans kind of really makes this really abrupt because it's trying to compensate for that space versus this space on this side. And when you typeset it out, Diurna by being its space looser in general, so this kind of strategy would be more acceptable. You can get away with it in Diurna. Okay, so that covers the A. On the D, I find that Gill Sans, so there's a tension in sans serifs versus calligraphic traditions, and Gill Sans I think steps more aggressively away from calligraphy in a lot of ways, but tries to make up for it in other directions. I think the D is a good example. So here's a big note. Look at this bottom terminal of this D. Notice between the two. Gill Sans does this treatment of like a 90-degree angle end. This is very geometric. I mean, it's very modular and it's very rationalized. And what's interesting as a result of that, of having this 90-degree angle over here, the momentum of the curves on the top up here have to push like this. There's like this momentum this way going on an upright angle in how the strokes handle. I think probably because of how flat this bottom part of the stroke is, to kind of make it not feel so static and just so rigid, the design had to create this upward pushing momentum in the bowl, in the round stroke part of that D, to make it feel more comfortable in some way. Meanwhile, with Diurna, there's the opposite. There's this momentum more pushing downward to the left side. So imagine it starts up a little bit and then it has to come down, and then it has to push, has that momentum going in the down left because of this, again, tapering in towards the stem. It has to come back up to connect to the stem. So as a result, the arch of Diurna's bowl has to arch downward to the left. Ugh, I keep saying right, the left side. While Gill Sans arches to the upside. See up here? Compare the two. We can also look at the counter. See at the counter, this has this arch over this way, while this arch down over here. So there are design decisions that resulted in how the curves are rendered very differently. And in general, we can definitely see how the terminals are handled. Diurna has these angle terminals, calligraphic sourcing, kind of giving this kind of sourcing calligraphy. Gill Sans, 90-degree angles, flat cut terminals, horizontal and vertical. Gives a more regimented, rigid feeling to everything. On to the G. So on the G, there's a couple of things. I think the big thing for me, looking at this, it's a very interesting move in Diurna, is where does the neck connect? I find it so interesting. The neck really connects actually from all the way on the right side of that bowl of the G. And then it has to swoop all the way over and then come back. That's a long time to connect. And over, basically from the right side all the way to the left side. As a result, there has to be this compensation. All this weight over here has to get compensated with a lot of tapering over here to make that letter feel more balanced overall. Meanwhile, with Gill Sans, it starts relatively more towards the center and more to the left side leaning. That's more what you would expect. So it doesn't have to be so dramatic in its arc transition. At the bottom part of the bowl to the spine, basically connecting to the spine to the loop. So notice over here how steep of an angle this part of the spine has to be, right? When it goes from into the link into the neck. Compare that to this. This takes way more time in Diurna. It has to move over way more time. It's spending more time doing it, so it's very challenging to draw that. And that has a couple of consequences. One is, if you look at the loop, notice that this is a sharp transition right over here. Probably as a composition. That takes so much time on the upper part of the neck to the spine. The loop area down here has to be more abrupt to compensate for that design decision. While in Gill Sans, because it starts sooner with the neck, the design can get away with a smooth transition counter in the bottom part of the G, in the loop counter. So I like to talk about this because while they're both speaking this Humanist sans serif model, or that's the genre they're talking about, design decisions made have consequences that compound on each other and have to interact with each other as a result. And that's probably why, for example, notice the smoothness of these counters and how these treatments are handled in Gill Sans that related to the other kind of like modularizing, smoothing out system of Gill Sans. The ear of the G basically connects right from the top of the bowl, and it's a very perfect block square. While looking at the instincts of Diurna, with the sharpness of this counter over here, probably a more pithy, like sharp ear makes more sense in this case. So it snaps in over there. Because that's the thing, you're trying to match basically all these different ingredients and typefaces. You want to snap them together and make a recipe that works well and complements each other. Those are decisions behind that. Okay, so that's the G. The R is also a fun one. So it comes down to, R's are really interesting because there's always this issue of an R has to show a lot of weight on the arm, like this part right here, and then it has to really rapidly decrease in weight so that the main stem area doesn't get too blobby. Basically, this joint area between the two is a serious area of contention and as a typeface designer. And there's a whole bunch of different strategies of how you can solve that problem, but that's one of the things as a type designer you're going to look for, is in the lowercase r, how is contrast introduced at that joint so that you can get the maximum weight at the arm, the end terminal area of the R, right over here, but yet not blob up this connection area so that you get a clear, basically a clear legibility of the letter. Because if it's all the same weight, then you can't read it. It doesn't really work very well. Okay, with that long-winded introduction, let's go over how these designs are handling themselves. So Gill Sans makes the decision to really dramatically cut the weight at the joint and get a very strong weight in the end terminal and then rapidly taper it out. And it's kind of like basically this very flat, very sharp triangle introduced at this top corner right here. See this triangle right here? Let's compare that to Diurna, much more shallow. This triangle, kind of imagine this counter being cut into the shape, the joint area. It's much shallower in Diurna, while in Gill Sans it's much more abrupt and stronger. Also notice the length of the arching in the bottom part is much longer in Gill Sans. Diurna is much more abrupt. It doesn't take as much time transitioning from the neck, from the joint over to the arm, while in Gill Sans it's much longer period of time. Diurna does this interesting move where, okay, so there's all this calligraphic sourcing happening. And this whole time, you have this angle. See this angle here? It's basically mimicking calligraphy. Here, there's this, basically what it seems like to me is that, okay, imagine the angle's here, right? And then all of a sudden, basically, it starts rotating and ends this way. So it goes, basically, it's like a rotation of the stroke occurs in Diurna. And basically by being so shallow as a joint, it decides, like, that's okay. It could basically stay a certain amount of weight over here and still maintain itself. this will be legible. But if you look really closely, if you notice that this top part of the terminal, right, of the R, it's tapered in. It's pushing inward. The designer knew he needs to get white in there somehow. If it was a perfectly straight stroke like this, imagine the terminal is like this, right, like that, versus this. See the difference? Where, yeah, I'm going to color it in so you can see. Basically, if it was this one, a straight terminal, it would be too blobbed up, especially by the designer not willing to decrease this weight over here too much. As a result, it'd be too blobbed up. So the solution was to taper in this stroke angled in that maybe handled differently in other letters, but in this letter, it was chosen to do it that way. So this is type design, real nerd action, where we're just really getting in there and showing you the kind of mechanics of how type designers work. Because the problem is, when you introduce extreme contrast like this over here, right? Here's the problem. What happens then when you go to letters that don't have a lot of contrast introduced, right? Like this G, for example. That same degree of contrast does not exist even at the most extreme points, right? Over here, let alone other low point notes like here, in here, and here. It's a dilemma type designers have to deal with, especially when they want to make sans serifs for text, is when you introduce low contrast in your design, there are moments where you're going to have to introduce contrast somehow. And your decision is, do you maintain consistency, or do you have to introduce variance in your contrast to make the whole system work? Those lowercase r is a really great example in Gill Sans of the compromises that have to be made in some directions to resolve that. And Diurnal shows some innovative solutions of, like, when you're saying, no, this is my contrast, I will not yield from it, I have to make other solutions to compensate for that. I wanted to share that with you guys. Okay, the S. So a couple other notes. One thing I want to notice is, notice how the spine is handled. This is much more shallow of a spine. Like, notice the angle of how the spine is handled versus the more time the spine takes over here in this S. This has to do more proportion, I think, than anything else. Gill Sans is just a narrow proportion overall by default. Diurnal is much wider. So the spine just has more, the S can be wider and spend more time defining itself. And introducing more positive space, more counter space between in the S compared to here. So they maximize white space. Usually as a letter gets narrower, in the case of the S, the spine has to get steeper, like it's a steeper angle this way versus this way to get more white in the letter. Figured I'd share that with you guys. And also notice the, again, angled terminals versus the flat terminals of Gill Sans. Across the two of those. So let's close with the uppercase letters. There are just a couple of notes on the uppercase letters I wanted to share with you. One thing to notice is that Diurnal has just wider capitals, especially in letters like the F and the E. So if you look at this width, like notice these two to these widths, F basically, Gill Sans tries to play more of that classical Roman idea, where certain letters are super wide, and certain letters are more narrow. This is kind of more ancient Roman tradition, and it plays off that idea. Diurnal does not really play by that rule as much. It kind of gives a more averaged out width across the letters in the uppercase. With some exceptions. Things like the X. X is a fun one, because I always find so interesting in Gill Sans this gigantic wide X. It's huge. It's probably the width of an H. It's gigantic. And Diurnal has a much more reasonable width X. It was always a peculiarity of Gill Sans I always found so interesting. That some letter decisions were just like this ridiculous, like, huge proportion. Like it'd be like this. Like basically imagine like that X next to the E's from the previous slide, right? So there's like this big interplay of the capital with proportions going on that Diurnal does not do as much. But I think that's interesting. I think that very clearly shows, you know, sometimes you want that big interplay of widths, of the widths of the capitals especially. Gill Sans might make more sense in that case. If we want something more averaged out, kind of more consistent within the capital spacings, Diurnal might make more sense as a direction. Okay, So what can we include from this very long conversation about Humanist sans serifs? So there are a couple of things. I think one is Gill Sans, I think, really is a classic example of the compromises that have to be made to a typeface to make it work, especially as a sans serif that with these humanist tradition ideas. And I wanted to basically say that Gill Sans might be the one we talk about in Type 1 classes, but it's a whole genre within itself with lots of different possibilities that it's up to you. It's up to you as a designer, as you're picking these typefaces. What do you want? Obviously, Gill Sans has a certain it's so used and it has such a flavor. It's so Gill Sans that maybe you want that, maybe you not. I think a lot of it has to deal with the contradictions in introducing some of the forms, like in the R or the A in this case, that can be very interesting and it can add a lot of surprising flavors to your typeface project, to you're working with it. Or even, and sometimes you don't want that. Sometimes you want just a smoothed out edition. You want it less idiosyncratic and more plain spoken in how it's handling itself. And Diurnal's one would be one of those examples. It makes other compromises to introduce this idea of a low contrast, humanist sans inspired project. But with that said, also Diurnal also really kind of beats more of the hammer of that calligraphic sourcing with those angled terminals, and I think the overall looser spacing of it. It seems it marks itself as a text face, and it seems to really push that point very strongly. So it might make sense to use Diurnal as your body copy, and Gill Sans also by its default spacing it just makes more natural sense as more of a subdeck or headline idea, and just in this context between the two of them, because of the focus on more of spacing economy in Gill Sans. This is Thomas Jockin. I hope you learned a lot from this conversation. What do you guys think? What do you guys use these projects for? What are your meditations or thoughts on Humanist sans serifs? Which ones do you really stand out to you and think are really successful? I hope you all have a great, fantastic week. I already am myself. As I said earlier, it was my birthday this weekend, and it was super fun. Thank you all for being here for Type Thursday. I look forward to talking about typefaces more next week, and I hope you all have a great week. Take care. Bye.